Over a third of the way through the season, Wolves still haven't won a game. With 2 draws and 12 defeats from their opening 14 matches, Wolves are currently on course to end the season with just 5 or 6 points to their name, making them roughly twice as bad as Derby County in the 2007-08 season, who are the worst Premier League team of all time. At this same stage in 2007-08, Derby had 6 points to their name, 3 times as many as Wolves, and unlike Wolves, they had claimed their first win. It would also be their last. Wolves have already lost against all 3 promoted clubs this season. They didn't register a shot on target in their 1-0 defeat at home to Forest until injury time midweek, and their top scorer this season literally has 1 Premier League goal. After 14 matches, we haven't seen Wolves this bad since Little Red Riding Hood, and 4 out of their next 5 games are against Manchester United, Arsenal, Liverpool, and then Manchester United again. 5 years ago, Wolves are being talked about as a model club. Following promotion from the Championship as one of the most formidable teams that English football's second tier had ever seen, Wolves secured back-to-back 7th place finishes in the Premier League, as well as reaching the quarter-finals of the Europa League. At a time when the likes of West Brom, Stoke, Birmingham, Villa, Derby and Forest were all struggling, Wolves appeared to be primed to become the leading club in the Midlands. Their squad boasted Portuguese internationals like Ruben Neves, Pedro Neto, João Moutinho, Rui Patricio and the late Diogo Jota, plus Mexican talisman Raul Jimenez, who scored 44 goals in his first 2 seasons at the club. Now it's Villa and Forest who are in Europe though, as Birmingham, Stoke and Coventry all compete at the top end of the Championship. Meanwhile, Wolves look to be at risk not only of relegation this season, and indeed humiliation, but potentially something a whole lot worse long term. A gradual decline since Nuno Espirito Santo left the club in 2021 has turned into a total collapse this season, as Wolves have gone from surviving by 17 points last season, in which they were sandwiched between Europa League finalists Tottenham and Manchester United, to being on course to be the worst team, statistically, that the division has ever seen. So just where did it all go so badly wrong? And why has everything got so catastrophically worse this season? Well, funnily enough, that's what today's video is all about. So sit back, relax, and join me on a miserable journey to Wolverhampton. And no, that isn't every journey to Wolverhampton. I won't be having a word of that nonsense. As we take a look at where the Wolves might finally be the team to break Derby County's unwanted record, how the club has ended up in such a sorry state, and why the worst may very well still be to come. Wolves have been in a state of complacency, arrogance, and inertia for a number of years. I last made a video about Wolves, titled What on Earth is Going On at Wolves, in August 2023, on the same day, coincidentally, that manager Julian Lopetegui walked out owing to disagreements with regards to the direction of the club and their recruitment. In the end, Wolves were fine that season, surviving by a fairly emphatic 20 points, and they ended up in a similarly comfortable predicament last season, finishing 17 points above the drop, despite an absolutely wretched start. This wasn't the result of masterful planning, or pulling any tricks out of their sleeves that I hadn't anticipated 2 and a bit years ago, but rather, it was primarily a case of the 3 promoted clubs being historically dreadful. Luton, Burnley and Sheffield United set the record as the worst promoted trio of all time in the 2023-24 season, all 3 of them sent straight back down with an average of just 22 points to their name, before Leicester, Ipswich and Southampton broke that record only the following season, winning an average of fewer than 20 points. Less, I should really say. You can trace the arrogance and complacency of Wolves' owners Fossen International and their longtime chief executive Jeff Shee, one of very few long-time incumbents at Molineux, all the way back to at least 2020. This was the high point of Fossen's ownership of Wolves, coming off the back of a second successive 7th place finish in the Premier League, following promotion from the Championship. It is always worth noting, both in the interest of balance, but also in order to emphasise just how badly things have gone wrong, that Fossen and Shee's tenure has been a tale of extraordinary highs and lows. As Jeff Shee pointed out, Accurately, albeit perhaps not all that helpfully in terms of comms, when Fossen bought Wolves, the club were in the bottom half of the Championship, they had played in League One more recently than the Premier League, and they hadn't survived in the top flight of English football for 5 successive seasons, they are now on their 7th, since the late 70s and early 80s, over 40 years ago. Their back-to-back 7th place finishes were the club's best since the 1979-80 season, again, over 4 decades ago, in which they also won the League Cup. Nonetheless, coming off the back of that success, for which both Fossen and she were widely lauded, not least by Wolves supporters, the club signed Fabio Silva for a club record fee from Porto, reportedly worth £35 million. It is easy to criticise an unsuccessful signing with the benefit of hindsight, and we will shortly get into Wolves' recruitment record, which has become progressively more disastrous over time, but Silva was an 18-year-old who had made 21 first-team appearances for Porto, and had scored precisely 1 Senior League goal. No doubt, Wolves would point to their outstanding record when it came to recruiting Portuguese players, many of them also young, and indeed a Portuguese manager in the form of Nuno Espirito Santo, thanks to Fossen's relationship with Portuguese super agent Jorge Mendes. But this was different. Though Ruben Neves was only 20 when Wolves signed him, he'd already played close to 100 games in the Porto first team, had become the youngest captain in the history of the UEFA Champions League, and he was already a full Portuguese international. Diogo Jota, likewise, also aged only 20, had just spent a full season on loan at Porto from Atletico Madrid, in which he made 37 appearances, 8 of them in the Champions League. What's more, Wolves were signing the pair of them to play for them in the Championship, arguably a significant drop in standards to what they were both used to, at least at continental level. Fabio Silva, by contrast, was totally unproven. He had an excellent reputation within Portugal's youth ranks, but he was still an unknown quantity in the Portuguese Primeira Liga, on the basis of having scored 1 goal in 12 games as an 18-year-old, let alone the Premier League. It's a point that I've made in the past on this channel, but whereas Man City or PSG may have the resources, and, by extension, the luxury of taking £35 million flyers on a few wonder kids every couple of years in the hope that 1 or 2 of them may work out, Wolves are not Man City or PSG. There was a sort of supreme arrogance, to my mind at least, in forking out that amount of money and taking such a ludicrous risk, ahead of only the club's 3rd season back in the top flight, still with among the lowest revenues in the Premier League, when there were genuine problems within the Wolves squad that needed to be addressed. This was the same summer that the late Diogo Jota, who scored 16 goals and made 6 assists the previous season, joined Liverpool for over £40 million, and Wolves reinvested basically all of that money in a striker, with 1 career league goal to his name. There was, of course, an element of misfortune in Wolves' talisman Raul Jimenez fracturing his skull just a few months into the season, thrusting Silva, who was supposed to be his young understudy, into the club's starting 11 much earlier than anticipated. Adjusting to the Premier League is difficult enough, but for an 18-year-old with little to no experience in men's football, even in a vastly inferior league, leading the line on his own, Silva was bullied and his confidence was shot to pieces, likely with long-term ramifications, but this was a problem entirely of the club's making. Fabio Silva scored 4 goals in 64 games for Wolves, all of them coming in his debut campaign, before being sold permanently to Borussia Dortmund in August, and no one at Molineux scored more than 6 Premier League goals in either the 2021-22 or 2022-23 seasons. You can view this purely through the lens of poor recruitment, which it was, but I think it was really a tale of hubris, and it is one which foreshadowed so much of what has followed over the last 5 years. Fast forward to the summer just gone, in which Wolves seemed to be shocked that players weren't falling over themselves to sign for them, and I think that, despite multiple changes of sporting directors and managers, that toxic cocktail of arrogance and complacency still pervades from the top. Wolves spent much of last summer chasing Spanish youth international Marc Pubil as a long-term replacement for a 33-year-old Matt Doherty at right back, or right wing back, and seemed to be bemused that he chose to join Atletico Madrid instead. Left floundering after Pubil's rejection, Wolves wound up signing Belgian fullback Jackson Chichua from Hellas Verona after the season had already started. The club's recruitment has been a disjointed mess for a number of years, impacted by cost-cutting, regulatory concerns, and a near total absence of stable and competent senior management. Wolves have consistently sold their best players, particularly over the last 3 years, as Matheus Nunes and Ruben Neves departed in 2023, Pedro Neto and Max Kilman in 2024, and Matheus Cunha and Rayan Aït-Nouri in 2025. The Premier League's brilliantly run 3Bs, Brentford, Brighton and Bournemouth, Burnley, may have created a perception that it is possible to sell your best players every season without suffering any major regression or consequences, but the way in which they operate is incomparable to Wolves. Brentford and Brighton benefit from complex in-house data analytics firms, managed and run by their owners, which guides their recruitment. They are obsessed with maximising value by meticulously analysing underexplored markets, and they operate within a hyper-efficient framework which ensures consistency, even when coaches and executives come and go. Bournemouth's recruitment, meanwhile, is data-informed, as opposed to data-led, through the use of licensed analytics platforms as opposed to their own in-house software, and combined with extensive traditional scouting networks. Bournemouth, like Brighton, are also part of a multi-club ownership group, benefiting from greater knowledge of markets like France and Portugal, where the Cherries' chief Bill Foley also owns clubs, and directly signing players as the MCO Group's apex club, such as Eli Krupe from sister club Lorient, who has scored 4 goals in 6 games so far this season. Wolves, in what can only be described as fairly stark contrast, enjoyed their greatest success during the first half of the Fossen era, with a recruitment strategy which was based upon their relationship with Portuguese super agent Jorge Mendes, and basically signing a shed-load of his clients. Whilst initially highly mutually beneficial, the relationship became increasingly parasitic over time, but Wolves have struggled to wean themselves off Mendes' teat. That's a powerful image, isn't it? They promoted Matt Hobbs from chief executive to sporting director 3 years ago in an effort to diversify their recruitment and professionalise overall operations, but Hobbs was effectively operating with his hands tied behind his back. Fosun International, a Chinese multinational conglomerate which was founded by Guo Guangchang and 4 others, bought Wolves in 2016, at a time when the holding company was posting record profits, and Chinese President Xi Jinping had encouraged a wave of investment in football at home and abroad by the country's businesses and billionaires. You may recall that Chinese Super League clubs, backed by some of China's largest companies and richest business people, sanctioned record deals for the likes of Hulk, Oscar and Carlos Tevez. Meanwhile, Chinese firms and billionaires acquired several European clubs, including both Inter and AC Milan. They were especially prolific in the West Midlands, for some reason, where West Brom, Wolves and Aston Villa were all acquired by Chinese businesses or businessmen. Meanwhile, Birmingham City had previously, and indeed disastrously, been owned by Hong Kong businessman Carson Young. China's spending spree ended about as rapidly as it had begun, though, owing to fears within the CCP that especially China's overseas investments in football was facilitating significant capital flight with very little in the way of return. By 2017, Xi Jinping had already U-turned on encouraging Chinese firms to invest in foreign football, and by 2021, the state had effectively banned companies from doing it. Most Chinese owners, from Southampton to the Milan Giants, sold up, company names were banned within the Chinese Super League, and several clubs were dissolved. Jiang Sun Suning, who won the Chinese Super League with players like former Liverpool and Chelsea targets Alex Teixeira in 2020, were dissolved before the start of the following season, along with fellow former brief big spenders like Guangzhou Evergrande, Hebei China Fortune, and Tianjin Tenhai. Just a few years earlier, these clubs employed the likes of Ezequiel Lavezzi, Paulinho, and Axel Witsel. They were managed by the likes of Fabio Capello, Manuel Pellegrini, and Fabio Cannavaro, and they were outspending several Premier League clubs. Wolves were actually fairly unusual, therefore, in their Chinese owners not selling up or pulling the plug entirely, but there was a notable shift in ambition, coincidentally or otherwise, around the time of Xi's announcement and China's rule changes around foreign investments in football in 2021. This probably wasn't helped, it should be said, by Fossen's own downturn in fortunes. having recorded record profits in 2017, the same year that Wolves signed the likes of Ruben Neves and Diogo Jota, and appointed Nuno Espirito Santo in the Championship. The company was hit hard at the start of the 2020s. The Chinese property sector crisis, sparked by the Evergrande Group defaulting, another firm which invested heavily in football, had significant ramifications for the whole Chinese economy, but Fosson's real estate interests were especially heavily impacted, and it was the onset of COVID that caused the real crisis to begin. Fosson is a diversified holding company. The firm's co-founder, Guo Guangchang, is one of 3 investors, to frequently be referred to as China's Warren Buffett, but Fosson's high level of exposure to industries like tourism and retail, which were decimated by extreme lockdown restrictions and depressed consumer demand, saw their profits collapse. By 2022, the company began shedding some of its assets in an effort to avoid defaulting on their short-term loans, and later that year, they announced plans to offload up to $11 billion in non-core assets over the next 12 months in an effort to generate short-term revenue and streamline the company's operations. As many people noted, for a Shanghai-based multinational corporation, whose biggest sectors are healthcare and pharmaceuticals, banking and insurance, and tourism and leisure, assets don't come all that much more non-core than a football club in the West Midlands. Nonetheless, Fosson maintained that Wolves weren't for sale, a position which they still hold to this day, and that they would only be open to minority partners and investors. In 2021, they sold a minority stake in the club to American investment firm Peak Six, reported to be around 8% of the club, but they bought it back for a reported $50 million, or £39 million, just over a year ago. There were some suspicions at the time that the repurchase could have been in preparation for a full sale, but nothing has materialised on that front over the last 12 months, and Fosson's public position is unchanged. Their repurchase would value Wolves at approximately $625 million, or £470 million, which is about 50% more than the Saudis paid for Newcastle 4 years ago. Which seems, shall we say, a bit unlikely. Another problem for Fosson, aside from the highly centralised Chinese state actively discouraging foreign investment in football, and the company being on the bones of its arse during COVID, was the club's own stagnant revenue. Between the 2018-19 season, which was Wolves' first back in the Premier League, and the 2023-24 season, which was their 5th, Wolves' revenue only rose by 3%. In real terms, therefore, it actually fell. Even when Wolves finished 7th in back-to-back campaigns, they only had the 11th and the 16th highest revenue in the Premier League. The 16th placed ranking in 2019-20 is a little bit misleading. Along with the club's higher revenue in 2020-21, it was basically the result of shifting the accounting period, but the fact remained that Wolves couldn't crack the Premier League's top 10 in terms of revenue, even while playing in Europe, trailing the likes of Leicester, Everton and West Ham. In February 2019, Fosson outlined plans to carry out extensive renovations at Molineux, which would include expanding the stadium's capacity by almost 50%, up from just under 31,000 to a little over 46,000 in the second phase of development. Laurie Dalrymple, who was the club's managing director at the time, told Sky Sports, quote, "There has never been any lack of ambition for us to take the capacity into the 50,000s or higher, but we have to respect what the market dynamics are telling us, and we have to be adopting a more realistic and pragmatic approach that we are comfortable with. So, with that in mind, we are presently looking at a further 2 phases to the project that would take the figure from 31,500 to about 36,000 in phase 1, with a view to a further phase lifting it to 45 to 46,000 in phase 2. End quote. With Fosson's downturn though, as investment slowed, stadium renovations were shelved. Speaking about Molineux in July 2025 by contrast, Wolves chairman Jeff Shee told the Business of Sport podcast, quote, "We have 32,000 seats at the moment, and I think it's good enough. Maybe 35 or 40 is the max for the city, but it's not very urgent. I think the urgent change is we should have more hospitality areas to serve the clients from business. If they want to have a better environment to have a conference or eat there, we should do more on this." End quote. It was a pretty radically different message from 2019 to 2025, and it is reflective of a transformation in terms of ambition that has taken place at Wolves over the last 6 years. Laurie Dalrymple left Wolves after being placed on gardening leave in July 2019, and brought an employment tribunal against the club, which he later abandoned. Matt Hobbs' recruitment, therefore, was hampered by cost-cutting and ostensibly by PSR considerations, and last June, he left the club by mutual consent. 2 months later, Hobbs joined Crystal Palace as their director of football. Hobbs' Wolves departure was part of a broader restructuring of the club's football operations. This was a fancy way of saying that Wolves were concentrating power in the hands of Vitor Pereira. It is easy for neutrals to forget, given how comfortably they survived in the end, but Wolves actually made a similarly disastrous start to last season. When Gary O'Neill was sacked and Vitor Pereira was appointed, Wolves had won just 2 of their opening 16 matches, and they sat 19th in the table, at serious risk of relegation. Pereira took Wolves back to basics, and oversaw an extraordinary run of 6 straight victories in March and April, which guaranteed the club's survival. Unsurprisingly, Pereira was hugely celebrated at Molineux by the club's supporters and owners alike, and, with what was already a weak and ineffective structure, the decision was made to grant Pereira much more far-reaching control than a head coach typically wields in the modern game. The January arrivals of Emmanuel Agbadou and Marshall Mendes, which were driven by Pereira personally, and deemed to have been transformative by the Wolves board, further enhanced his reputation. Wolves allowed Pereira to bring in Domenico Tete as the club's director of football in June, who Pereira had worked alongside at Al-Shabaab in Saudi Arabia, effectively as Matt Hobbs' replacement, and commenced negotiations over extending his contract. The list of targets that had been drawn up by Wolves' pre-existing recruitment department, headed by Hobbs, was effectively torn up, with Pereira and his allies exercising unprecedented influence over incomings and outgoings. This is not dissimilar to what Aston Villa have done with Unai Emery, and with great success it must be said, managing to attract a manager who is probably a level above them, or at least a level above where they were when he arrived, by allowing him far greater power and influence than he would be afforded at a super club, but it's not without great risk. For a start, Vitor Pereira is not someone who is renowned for sticking around at clubs for long. Wolves were the 9th club that Pereira had managed in the space of just 10 years, with his longest stint coming at Shanghai SIPG during the peak of China's short-lived investment in football boom. Secondly, and this is also true with Villa for Emery, it means that when the manager that you have handed the keys to the kingdom finally departs, you are effectively back to square one in terms of your structure and senior management. What's more, whilst Pereira and his allies were, by and large, allowed to dictate Wolves' transfer targets, because Wolves were either unwilling or unable to attract their top targets, in some cases, as was reported by Steve Madeley in The Athletic last month, they only actually ended up with their 4th or 5th choice targets in some positions. Wolves didn't sign a single player over the summer with a single second of Premier League experience, with the sole exception of Jorgen Strand Larsen, whose loan move became a permanent one. In fact, Wolves haven't signed what you might deem to be a proven Premier League player since at least Sam Johnston over a year ago, and even that is debatable, and probably not since veteran centre-back Craig Dawson definitively, who joined Wolves from West Ham in January 2023, and whose contract expired at the end of last season. Again, it seems to me that there is a persistent theme of arrogance and complacency among the Wolves hierarchy, that they can sell their best players, sign unknown quantities, often with quite rudimentary recruitment processes, and still survive in the Premier League, which was most likely only exacerbated by how bad the promoted clubs have been in recent years. Over the summer, Wolves lost probably their 2 best players in Ray Nori and Mateus Cunha, along with Gonçalo Guedes, who played 33 games last season, and Pablo Sarabia, Nelson Semedo and Craig Dawson, who made over 80 appearances between them. This was already a squad that was in the relegation zone last Christmas, survived thanks to a Pereira-inspired run of 6 games in spring and the worst promoted trio of all time, and which hadn't been properly refreshed in over half a decade, now stripped of its 2 best players and several first-team regulars, and therefore in desperate need of a major rebuild. Rarely has there been a more obvious one-man team in the Premier League than Matheus Cunha at Wolves last season. The Brazilian either scored or assisted almost 40% of all of Wolves' goals, winning the Man of the Match award 9 times in 33 games. Cunha won the Man of the Match award then, in 1 out of 4 of Wolves' matches, despite the fact that he missed 5 games throughout the season. The next most Man of the Match awards won by anyone at Wolves was 3 players who were tied on 2 awards, 2 of whom, Ray and Aït-Nouri and Mario Lemina, are also no longer at the club. Cunha wasn't just the best player at Wolves, whereas towering Norwegian centre-forward Jørgen Strand Larsen requires service in order to flourish, Cunha was capable of creating something out of nothing. Without him, now Wolves just have nothing. Their top scorers in the Premier League this season, a tie between 6 players, all have 1 goal. Pereira's watered-down 4th and 5th choice recruitment has been a total disaster. Not one of Wolves' 6 summer signings, brought in for close to £100 million, has made any kind of positive impression. I have a bit of a soft spot for Ladislav Krejci, signed on loan from Girona, but permanent signings Fer Lopez, Jean Arias, David Muller-Wolf, Jackson Chichua, and Tolu Erekadere have all been horrendous. Strand Larsen, whose loan move became a permanent one, hasn't been much more impressive. Fer Lopez is currently injured, though he barely featured when fit and looked totally anonymous when he did. Jean Arias has looked less than useless, and Jackson Chichua has been a total car crash at fullback. I'm running out of pejoratives, though striker Tolu Erekadere has perhaps been the biggest disappointment of all. The biggest signing at Molineux over the summer, brought in for £24 million from Belgian outfit Genk, Erekadere has no goals or assists from his opening 10 games. He has registered just 9 shots in total, and only 1 of them has hit the target. He has the same number of shots on target this season as Harry Maguire, but not quite as many goals. Erekadere has an expected goals of 0.5. Not in his last game, but all season, across 10 matches. That's half the expected goals of former Wolves centre-back Nathan Collins, now of Brentford, and less than the likes of Lewis Dunk, Ethan Ampadu, and James Tarkowski. This is a £24 million Nigerian international centre-forward. In the interests of balance, he has scored 2 in 2 in the League Cup, but let's be honest, these are absolutely horrendous numbers overall. Despite an abysmal start to the campaign, Wolves reached an agreement with Vitor Pereira regarding his contract extension on September 18th. Wolves had lost each of their opening 4 matches, but the club had backed themselves into a corner where they either U-turned, effectively undermining Pereira and any authority that he had left, probably forcing them to sack him at that stage, or to double down, sign the contract, and take the risk of handing a beleaguered manager who had overseen a terrible start a brand spanking new deal. They opted for the latter, but just 45 days after signing a 3-year extension, Pereira was sacked. 2 days later, his director of football Domenico Tete followed. Last season, Gary O'Neill was sacked in remarkably similar circumstances, just 4 months after penning a new 4-year deal. It speaks to a total lack of vision or any kind of coherent long-term plan by Fossen or Jeff Shee, which has been obvious to Wolves supporters for a long time. Protests against the owners and Shee are now in full swing, with Wolves fans having flashbacks to the chaos and despair that they felt during the early part of the 2010s, under the ownership of Steve Morgan, when they suffered back-to-back relegations. Pereira has been replaced, somewhat controversially, by Middlesbrough's Rob Edwards, who has a fairly mixed CV. Edwards did an outstanding job at Forest Green Rovers before walking out on them, and won promotion to the Premier League at Luton, but he was sacked after only 11 matches at Watford, suffered relegation in his only previous season managing in the Premier League, and he was sacked by Luton last season with the Hatters having lost their last 4, and on the verge of dropping into the Championship relegation zone. They would later be relegated without him. Middlesbrough put a big show of faith in Edwards by appointing him over the summer, and the way in which he walked out on them when Wolves came calling left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths. Wolves' performances have actually picked up since Edwards was appointed, at least in his first 2 games, and they were unfortunate not to win his opening match at home against Crystal Palace, and gave a decent account of themselves away at Aston Villa. The fact that they lost both games despite improved performances is all the more demoralising though, and Wolves were insipid midweek against Nottingham Forest, admittedly only losing the game 1-0, but offering next to nothing for fans at an increasingly despondent and apathetic Molineux to cheer about. In truth, Wolves haven't been quite as bad as the league table would suggest this season. Very bad, don't get me wrong, but not quite that bad. In terms of the underlying data, they rank 17th for expected goals, above Sunderland and Spurs, 14th for expected goals against, having given up fewer chances than Spurs, Forest and Everton, and 17th, so actually above the relegation zone, in terms of both expected points and expected goals difference. This is an indication of three things. 1. Wolves have been somewhat unfortunate. 2. There is a potential lack of resilience and belief which is seeing them drop points, even when their performances suggest that they probably shouldn't. And 3. Wasteful finishing and, most notably, shoddy goalkeeping. Both Jose Sarr and Sam Johnston have had stints in goal this season, and neither of them have impressed. As with so many issues at Wolves, this was eminently avoidable and should come as no surprise. Goalkeeper was a problem position coming into this season, as far as many Wolves supporters were concerned, yet nothing was done to address it. The hope from Wolves, it seems, was either that Jørgen Strand Larsen would kick on from an impressive debut campaign after they rejected the advances of Newcastle United, and keep them up single-handedly, or that the three promoted clubs, as has been the case over the last 2 years, would all be atrocious. Neither have materialised though, and now Wolves appear to be as good as relegated, before most people have even put up their Christmas trees or tinsel. Comparisons have been made to last season, but not only had Wolves had a much better start, despite much more difficult fixtures, they faced Arsenal, Chelsea, Newcastle, Villa, Liverpool and Man City, all in 6 of their opening 8 games, whereas they have lost to all 3 promoted clubs already this season. The promoted clubs are far superior to last season, with Sunderland practically as good as safe after a third of the campaign, and they don't have the mercurial magic of Matheus Cunha to fall back on. Opta now gives Wolves just a 3% chance of staying up, and even that feels somewhat generous. Rob Edwards says that the club will target players, at long last, with Premier League experience in the January window, but it is almost certainly too little too late. It's unclear what kind of budget he will be given, who will be the driving force behind the club's recruitment now that Pereira and his allies have departed, and indeed, perhaps most importantly, who would even want to join them, who would be capable of making a significant impact at least, in their current state. A lot of comparisons have been made, including by me in my last video about Wolves over 2 years ago, between Wolves and Leicester City, as the Foxes also fell from being potential Big Six disruptors and playing in Europe to relegation through a combination of complacency, ineptitude, and an ownership regime that was asleep at the wheel. Leicester are currently 16th in the Championship, and reportedly on the verge of a potential 9-point deduction, which would actually put them inside of the relegation zone. I think the comparison holds up in terms of the gradual stagnation, followed by a rapid downfall that has afflicted both clubs, but it is worth noting that there are differences. Leicester were relegated from the Premier League with the 7th highest wage bill in the division, and the highest outside of the Big Six, closer to Arsenal in 6th than the likes of Forest and Everton below them. The Foxes spent 116% of their turnover on wages, which was by far the highest figure in the Premier League, playing a large part in their PSR breaches in both divisions, which could only temporarily be resisted in court. Leicester also had a squad packed full of high earners, often on fairly lengthy contracts, who they couldn't offload, preventing them from meaningfully refreshing their squad. Wolves, by contrast, have among the lowest wage bills in the Premier League, and it would be even lower still if they didn't keep having to pay managers and their team's fat compensation packages. Wolves spend 80% of their turnover on wages, as per their last set of accounts, as Fossen have fought to make the club self-sustainable, reluctant to expand upon the £214 million of funding that they have injected into the club since they bought it, over 60% of which came in their first 3 years at the club. This, of course, has played a large part in bringing Wolves to this point, and the value of Fossen's asset is about to crash, along with the club's revenue, as a result of relegation. So none of this is a compliment, just to be absolutely clear, of the combination of austerity and mismanagement that they have inflicted upon the club in recent years. It is just to say that, at this stage, the situation at Wolves is markedly different to the situation at Leicester, who are in well over £200 million of debt, compared to £103 million at Wolves, so less than half as much. What may be of more concern is the percentage of Wolves' debt, almost all of it, £101 million, which is classified as external debt, owed to third parties like banks and financial institutions, rather than loans from their owners, which is what constitutes the lion's share of gross debt at most football clubs. Tottenham, Manchester United, Everton and Liverpool, two of whom have recently built highly lucrative brand new stadiums, and three of whom are among the biggest and richest football clubs in the world, are the only clubs in England with more external debt than Wolves. Instead of expanding or renovating Molineux in an effort to raise revenue, as was the plan in 2019, Fossen have simply hiked ticket prices every single season that they have owned the club. Perhaps they could justify hikes when Wolves were battling for European qualification, but when they are battling not to become the worst Premier League team of all time, the value proposition appears to be a little bit less compelling. This is an advert brought to you by me. A lot of people stop me in the street and say, "Wow, it's Alfie Potsama. You're the best football YouTuber in the world, and somehow even more handsome in real life than online. Please may I have your autograph, take a photo, and sleep with you?" And I have to say, look, I'm very sorry, that is awfully kind of you, but I do have a girlfriend. The other thing that they often say, I mean, almost always really, is there any way that I can get more of you? Is there perhaps a second channel of yours that I could subscribe to where you make to-camera documentaries about various interesting topics? And I say, yes, it's called the Alfie Potsama YouTube channel, and funnily enough, I just uploaded my latest video there about the Basque derby between Real Sociedad and Athletic Club, the history of Basque sport and culture, and why that game is so unique among major football rivalries. I know, it sounds fascinating, and it is, which is why I am advertising it to you now. No payments were made in exchange for this advert. HITC Sevens and Alfie Potsama are the same person. T's and C's apply. Now back to the video. Wolves are not the worst Premier League team of all time, whereas Derby and, more recently, the likes of Sheffield United or Southampton felt doomed going into every game, playing like a third division club coming up against a top-flight team in a cup competition each week. Wolves have, by and large, held their own in several games this season, and the underlying data suggests that they should probably sit just outside of the bottom three, let alone be on course for a 4 or 5 point season. I suspect that will tell eventually, and Wolves won't take Derby's unwanted record unless they are so thoroughly demoralised by recent defeats and the state of the league table that they simply down tools. Barring a miracle, they will be relegated either way though, and a great deal of uncertainty remains. Wolves are owned by a Chinese multinational conglomerate that appears to be disinterested in them, but refuses to sell them, is reluctant to invest but keeps asking fans to cough up more for tickets, and is not only wholly incapable of fixing their current problems, but has appeared oblivious and quite frankly delusional as to the state of the club for a number of years. But other than that, things are going pretty well. All I'll say is that as soon as Rob Edwards is handed a new 7-year deal, lump on him to be the next manager to be sacked. It's as close as you can get to a surefire thing in football. In all seriousness, Premier League executives are so competent, and clubs are so professional now, that there is no room for complacency or idiocy. If the 4th and 9th richest clubs in the entire world are capable of finishing 15th and 17th in the Premier League, as happened last season, then anyone outside of the rich 6 is more than capable of going down. When one or more promoted clubs put up a fight, any hint of weakness is likely to be brutally exposed. Unfortunately, Wolves have been more complacent than anyone, and their idiocy has been rivalled only by West Ham's. Following 5 years of gradual decline and stagnation, the strength of Sunderland, and to a lesser extent Leeds and Burnley, combined with managerial tumult and a transfer window from hell, have exposed years of mismanagement at Wolves. that is it for today's video, but thank you all very much, as ever, for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, probably not if you're a Wolves fan, let's be totally honest, but other people, or just if you found it interesting, I suppose, or you're just feeling generous, you know. It's around the festive season, why not? Also, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, should you have any, about this video or just in general. And of course, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on, not just for this channel, though also this channel if possible, HITC Sevens, but also my second channel, Alfie Potsama, both of which should be about to appear on your screens really any minute now, along with a couple of videos that you might enjoy watching after this one. You can also find me on various social media platforms, typically via the username at HITC Sevens, should you wish to do so. I recently hit 10,000 followers on Instagram, even though all I post there really is YouTube thumbnails, photographs of my two dogs, and share some music that I like. But, you know, the option's there should you wish to explore it, and some people have. You can also support me additionally now by becoming a channel member, either directly here on YouTube via the Alfie Potsama YouTube channel, or even better still, via buymeacoffee.com/Alfie Potsama, where you can do the exact same thing, but Google won't keep 30% of it. I know, pretty greedy, in my view anyway. But the option exists, should you wish to support me. It is much appreciated and genuinely really useful. But I will hope to see you all very shortly. Please take care out there. I love you all very much. Cheers.